So, two stories have dominated the mainstream media post-election. On one hand, we've got the Petraeus resignation love triangle story changing by the day, and on the other hand, there's the fiscal cliff. Let's take a look at the latter.
Congress returns to work today, and with the upcoming holidays, there are just weeks to negotiate a budget deal to avoid this proverbial fiscal cliff.
That's the package of big tax increases and budget cuts that take effect automatically at the end of this year, unless Congress and the White House can come up with a compromise on the federal budget.
The U.S. is facing more than $16 trillion in debt. Right now, there seems to be no plan, a cogent one at this point, to move forward on all of that.
So to break down exactly what this cliff entails and what it means for you and me, joining me is Lauren Lister, host of Capital Account right here on RT.
Yeah, thanks for having me on your show, Abby.
Thank you. So I don't think a lot of people understand all this rhetoric, of course, economics. There's a lot of mumbo jumbo being talked about, especially as we saw right there, including myself. I don't really understand what exactly is the fiscal cliff. Could you just explain it in layman's terms?
Of course. So the fiscal cliff is kind of the culmination of a few different things that are all going to be happening around the beginning of the year in January. So we have the expiration of the Bush tax cuts. So those are set to expire, and this is at the same time that the spending cuts from the sequestration, which is just however it was described when that debt ceiling deal was agreed upon last summer in 2011. It was the punishment for that deficit commission not being able to come up with cuts. So this was what was triggered. So those go into effect at the same time in January. So it's the culmination of these couple of different things being the major things. Also, some other tax cuts are expiring. There was a payroll tax holiday. That's one of them that's expiring. And a bunch of other things, actually. But the main ones are the Bush tax cuts and the sequestration spending cuts, all coming together at the same time, which is making people say, whoa, this is going to be horrible for economic growth and for jobs, because these things are all coming together at once. And there's the haphazard nature of just these, punishment spending cuts that some are concerned about. They would like a more targeted way to cut government spending. It's questionable whether that's ever achieved, but that's kind of the nuts and bolts of what's in the fiscal cliff.
So what does this mean for government? You just mentioned there's all these things kind of colliding all at once.
Yeah.
What exactly are they cutting? I mean, are they cutting all across the board, or are they favoring one sector or the other with the cuts? Talk a little bit about that.
So the sequestration cuts were $1.2 trillion over 10 years. We know that the government runs $1 trillion plus deficit, so you know what, that's one of those in 10 years. So it's not that significant. So it amounts to $110 billion each year, and the reason it doesn't add up perfectly is because interest counts in that $1.2 trillion savings, interest payments cut to them. So the sequestration, the down payment we'll pay on it for 2013 is $110 billion, $55 billion about from defense, $55 billion from non-defense. And your question about across the board, these are supposed to be across the board, kind of proportional cuts or caps. However, there are exemptions, I should note. Medicaid, food stamps, child nutrition, Social Security, SSI, which is like disability, refundable tax credits, earned income tax credit, veterans benefits, and are also exempt. So all of those are exempt. Those don't get touched.
So what about defense spending? I mean, don't you think that we could just cut it all from there, Lauren?
You are not going to get me to disagree with you there, of course. I mean, defense, I believe, and I think that there's lots to support this, is so bloated, with government asking for things, lawmakers asking for things that the military doesn't even say that they need. I mean, I think that there's a strong argument to be made about that, of course.
So how is this going to really, I mean, you say people are kind of freaking out about, what is this going to do to halt growth of the economy? Is this really going to impact you, me, everyone else, tax-paying citizens? I mean, cut through some of that. Right?
Yeah, okay. So let's talk about first what it means to you or I as just people, okay?
Yeah.
If the government goes off the fiscal cliff, so to speak, that means Bush tax cuts expire. That means people's taxes go up. So 3 to 5%, depending on the income tax bracket that you're in. So your taxes would go up. What it means for the payroll tax, if that expires, so that's been, do you remember when Obama gave those speeches, what would you do with $40 extra in your paycheck? Well, that was when he was lobbying for the payroll tax holiday. So that got lowered a little bit. That expires. So for the average person, $40 more taken out of their paycheck. So that's kind of what it means to you or I, just in terms of taxes, if we go off. In terms of what this means for the economy, if we do this, series of things all at once, which are contractionary, projections are that we could go back into a recession. That's what the CBO just recently said, that next year we would go back into recession. Unemployment would rise to 9.1%. Let me remind, these are all projections by the Congressional Budget Office. This is not by any means definitive. And so that would be the pain felt. However, they also found that longer term, this would actually be better for growth and better for joblessness, because you are actually kind of getting the fiscal deficit more in order, the budget deficit. If the fiscal cliff was not averted, so to speak, we would see $500 billion less added to the federal budget deficit next year, even less the following year. So there's a silver lining.
Isn't this just kind of putting a Band-Aid on a more deep-seated issue here about that we're on a debt-based economy that's really unsustainable in the long run? I mean,
Of course. Come on.
It's just ridiculous.
Okay, yeah, I mean, there's like a couple things. So even if there is a grand bargain or we go off the fiscal cliff, these are just such small things. We're talking about $110 billion in sequestration cuts for a year.
Yeah.
We're running a $1.whatever trillion deficit. So this is really a drop in the bucket. And in addition, there are these other things that play in. For example, why is the government borrowing so much? What enables this? Well, the Federal Reserve policy, with interest rates being so low, that helps the government finance its debts and deficits at ever lower amounts. I mean, interest payments on the debt are actually lower than they were a few years ago because of how low interest payments are, interest rates are. So yes, there are all these dynamics going on, and lots of issues that go beyond just this.
Of course, which is what you get into in capital account. It just seems like, Obama's out there bragging about how we're not going to cut defense, we're going to raise defense year after year. It just makes this all kind of meaningless when you see that they're really not going to plan to cut this bloated defense budget, really where people need it the most. But let's go over the rolling jubilee, this new Occupy Wall Street effort to absolve debt. Can you explain exactly, will this work, Lauren? Break this down just really quickly for us.
Okay, so how it works is that some banks, some lenders, they will sell bundles of distressed debts. So debts that their customers that borrow the money haven't been paying on. Maybe these banks and lenders want to write it down as a loss, get it off their books. So they will sell it at a discount of pennies on the dollar to debt collectors. So they can collect on the debts, and maybe they'll make some money, enough to recoup this great discount that they got on this debt, and that's something that goes on. So Occupy Wall Street has said, hey, we're going to raise money, buy some of this distressed debt at pennies on the dollar, and we're going to just forgive it. Instead of recouping those debt payments and harassing these people, we're going to forgive this debt, and it's going to be a debt jubilee. They're trying to raise, I think, $50,000 to forgive $1 million worth of debt. So does it work? It depends on what you consider working. I mean, people are $2.7 trillion in debt in this country, so $1 million is a very small drop in the bucket. There's a larger...
Do you think it's a good start for something that could be feasible?
I think that it's not something that could be feasible super broadly, but I think as what it means symbolically, I think it's really awesome, because I feel like it's a private solution, a private sector solution to something that is a really difficult thing, and people always look to the government and say, what's the government going to do? Like, forget about it,
Yeah, they're not going to do anything to absolve debt.
Yeah. So I just like that they're taking matters into their own hands and doing this. But big picture, I mean, what is this economy fueled on? Consumer spending. What do we continue to hear from politicians? Oh, consumer confidence is up. Consumers are spending again. We need to get consumers out spending again. Well, what does that mean? Taking on more debt so that they can spend more to fuel this economy than to be more indebted? I mean, it's the same pattern that's not getting broken or changed, although overdebtedness is a problem.
Absolutely. Thank you for breaking it down a little bit more. Our tease, Lauren Lister of Capital Account.